common element between Jesus and the Essenes on that either.
I wanted to ask if there is any connection with the Gospel of John, although in the Gospel of John there is a lot of anti-Jewish sentiments, but in the language, in the expressions of the Essene text, and especially that it's a community, the Johannine is spoken as a separate community. Some of the theories are that it was a closed community, and also the teachings were specific to a certain group and not to...
Although I don't think we can speak about esoteric teaching in the community of John, but the case of John is a bit special too. That's right. There have been specific studies on John and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there are also some aspects of Greek ideas in John. It's also very Hellenistic in many ways. So it's true that in the vocabulary of the Gospel of John, there is a vocabulary that could be closer to some of the Essene ideas than in the other Gospels. And you see, in all the polemics nearly that I've seen, it's Luke and Matthew. But John, it's different. Although you would still find many of the elements that I've highlighted that oppose Jesus and the Essenes, like on purity issues, for instance. It's not that Jesus in John is more concerned about purity, but there is a little bit of Sons of Light vocabulary in John and things like that. But again, is this specific enough? Can we, is it enough to speak about kind of contacts with Essenes, or is it just, okay, they speak about light, we speak about light. It's an open debate, let's say.
Sorry, but do we have records that show that the Pharisees or Sadducees were against the Essenes? Do we have polemics with these two groups or three groups?
Okay, we have evidence from the Qumran scrolls themselves. From the Essene scrolls from Qumran, there are polemics between them and other groups. So they don't call them Sadducees or Pharisees, they give them nicknames. But if we look at the later rabbinic literature, we see that we find the same kind of disagreements on the interpretation of the law as what we see in the Essene scrolls from Qumran. And we can identify the position of the adversaries of the Essenes with the position of the Pharisees. These are very technical debates. It's not extremely interesting. It has to do with, when you have a jar, and you pour a liquid in another recipient, and if the recipient here is impure, will the liquid create a kind of connection with the first recipient, and the impurity will go back to the first recipient, or, these kind of issues. So they were debating that very, very seriously. And so the position of the Essenes and the adversaries of the Essenes is exactly the position of the rabbis in rabbinic literature. So we can see, yes, that they were already arguing with each other, and although they don't call them Pharisees exactly.
Yes. So in the end, what do you think would have led Ernest Renan to propose that motion? Is it maybe the ascetic lifestyle shared by God?
Yes.
Or something else?
No, it has a lot to do. Actually, Ernest Renan did not know the Dead Sea Scrolls. So his impression was from the reading of Philo, Josephus, and Pliny. So Pliny's description is completely crazy in a way, because he says it's a community of men, they don't have women, and they've been living here for thousands of years, reproducing themselves without women. So it's like, okay, it's not very accurate, Philo presents the Essenes as an elite group within Judaism. They are particularly holy, and they look like Pythagorean philosophers. That's the way Philo describes them. Again, it's kind of apologetic. It's, it's just to say, look, Jews, they produce real models of holiness and philosophy and so on and so forth. It's for a Greek audience. So it's very difficult to understand what the Essenes really were before the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have a better description in Josephus. Josephus is really much more accurate. There are some very nice correspondences between Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But still, the general atmosphere is it's very exaggerated. They are praised. It's an idealization of the Essenes. It's like, they are wise, they are pious, they are everything. And they live in these communities, only men. Josephus says there are two groups. Some Essenes live as celibate, they do not have wives, and others have wives and children. But the main thing was they live in celibacy and they are praying all day. Like, it looked very much like monks, if you want. So even Pope, the previous Pope, not Benedict, yeah. Pope Benedict still wrote about the early Christians as being, continuators of the Essenes. It's the model of, ascetic lifestyle, community, sharing of the goods. That's also something that is very much highlighted by Philo. They do not have slaves. They do not own anything. They share everything in common. These were the ideas that made Essenes and Christians look very similar. But then actually when you read, for instance, the Damascus document, you see they share goods, but not necessarily everything. So when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's more complicated. It's less ideal than what Philo and others described.
Thank you. So you noted some of the similarities between the Aramaic text that you showed and then some of the beginning of Luke, the Son of the Most High, those expectations around the Messiah. And you said they didn't exist in any other Jewish texts except for this one. But you felt it was a widespread kind of commonly held view. Why then do you think that it doesn't exist in any other documents? How do you decide it's not an Essene view, but it's reflective of a wider view of the Messiah in the first century?
Okay, that's a big debate among Qumran scholars. What is an Essene text? What is not an Essene text? Especially with the text being so fragmentary, sometimes it's quite tricky. But there is a kind of a consensus that texts in Aramaic at Qumran are not Essene. They do not show any kind of, there's very specific ideas and terminology, even considering translating from Hebrew to Aramaic, of the Essene text. They seem to come from a different world, maybe even from the Jews in Mesopotamia or something like that. There is another text, the Book of Giants, that speak about Gilgamesh, for instance. So you see, it seems like it's connected to Mesopotamia in many ways. But of course, we cannot be 100% sure, but there is, let's say, as far as we know, there is no element that is Essene. And this is true also for the other texts I mentioned, for Q 521. So that's the main thing is terminology and specific ideas, references to the roles within the community. They have the master of justice, they have the inspector, they have really terminology and organization and things. And if it doesn't appear at all, or even dualistic thinking, for instance, would be considered maybe a sign of an Essene provenance, but also that could be debated, of course. It's very difficult, actually.
I seem to remember, but I may be mistaken, so correct me, that the Dead Sea Scrolls, all the things that they found, there was a fragment or a longer manuscript of every book of the Old Testament except Esther. Is that true?
Yes.
And do we have an explanation for that?
No, we do not have an explanation. We have a proto-Esther, which means we have a book in Aramaic speaking about a story that is very similar, but it's not the book of Esther. So it may be just by chance, copies of the book of Esther may have been very few, and by chance, no fragments survived. That's one thing. It may be also the book of Esther is pretty late. The Septuagint of Esther, according to somebody in France who has done a PhD on that, is very late. So maybe the final redaction was really in the 1st century BCE. We don't know. These are really open questions. But yeah, so far no scroll of Esther at Qumran. I don't think it has to do with the fact that there is not the name of God in the book of Esther or all that kind of thing. No, I don't think so. I don't think it's an ideological reason.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. And we join in continuing our discussion over a cup of coffee or tea outside. Thank you.
Thank you. How do I get my USB?